In 22 years on this bench, I have learned that the most dangerous moment in any courtroom is not when someone is lying. It's when someone is telling the truth, and no one in the room is equipped to hear it. A woman walked into my courthouse on a Tuesday morning in November. Blue supermarket uniform, name tag still on her chest, a plastic folder full of crumpled papers she had printed at a public library because she couldn't afford a lawyer. $14,000 in unpaid taxes on a house she had inherited. A corporation on the other side of the room with a briefcase that probably cost more than her monthly salary. On paper, she had already lost. The attorney stood up and delivered his case in 4 clean minutes. Dates, notices, statutes. The kind of presentation that wins before the other side even opens their mouth. And I sat there behind this bench, looking at the file, and everything in front of me said the same thing. Rule against her. Move on. Next case. But then I looked up, and sitting in the chair beside her, legs dangling above the floor, sock fallen down around her ankle, holding a worn-out teddy bear against her chest, was a 6-year-old girl. She looked at me the way children look at things they are trying to understand, and something in that look made me put down my pen. Because in this work you learn to feel the difference between a case and a story. The paperwork was a case. What was sitting in front of me was a story. And I had a feeling, the kind that lives below the ribs, below the law, below everything they teach you in 20 years of legal training, that the real reason those letters went unanswered had nothing to do with negligence. There was something underneath this case that the documents couldn't hold. And when I asked the question that changed everything, what came out of that woman's mouth silenced every person in that room. Before starting the story, comment here from where you are watching and what time it is there. If stories of justice, empathy, and hidden truths resonate with you, be sure to subscribe to the channel. There are cases I can still feel in my hands. Not metaphorically, I mean it literally. The way a surgeon might still feel the weight of a particular instrument decades after the operation. The way the wood of the gavel vibrates differently depending on what you've just decided. Some verdicts leave the hand numb, others leave it warm. The case I'm about to tell you about left my hand trembling. I've sat on this bench for 22 years, and in those 22 years I've learned something that no law school teaches. Something they cannot teach, because it doesn't live in a textbook. It lives in the space between a person's eyes when they're telling the truth. There's a particular stillness to it. The rest of the face might be crying, shaking, falling apart completely. But the eyes go very, very still, like the center of something that is spinning too fast everywhere else. I've learned to look for that stillness, because in this courtroom, the truth almost never arrives dressed properly. It doesn't come with the right paperwork. It doesn't come with an attorney. It doesn't come rehearsed or polished or punctual. The truth, in my experience, comes in wearing a wrinkled uniform with a name tag still clipped to the chest, holding a folder of papers that were printed at a public library at 7 in the morning because there was no printer at home and the case was at 9. That Tuesday morning in November started the way most mornings in this courthouse start. Cold. The kind of cold that gets into the building before anyone arrives and settles into the walls, into the wooden benches, into the light itself, turning it that particular shade of yellow that belongs only to old institutions, schools, hospitals, courthouses. A yellow that doesn't warm anything, a yellow that simply reveals. I remember the sound of the heating system clicking on and off in uneven intervals, never quite committing to warming the room. I remember the hum of the fluorescent lights above the gallery. I remember the smell. And if you've spent any time in a municipal courthouse, you know the smell. Old paper, burnt coffee from the break room down the hall, and underneath it, faint but persistent, the particular scent of people who put on their best clothes for a day they were terrified of. I had already reviewed the docket, 7 cases that morning. The Hayes matter was 3rd. I had glanced at it briefly the night before. Eviction proceeding, inherited property, unpaid municipal taxes, $14,200, corporate creditor, no legal representation on the defendant's side. I had seen versions of this case 100 times. The paperwork was clean, the precedent was clear, and on paper, strictly on paper, It was about as complicated as a Tuesday gets. I was not prepared for what walked through that door. The bailiff called the case. I looked up from my notes. She came in first. Donna Hayes, 34 years old, though she carried something heavier than 34 in the way her shoulders curved slightly inward, not from defeat, but from the long practice of making herself smaller in spaces that hadn't been built for her. She was wearing a blue supermarket uniform, the kind with a white trim on the collar and a plastic name tag that said Donna in the store's corporate font. She still had it clipped to her chest. I would later understand she hadn't had time to change. She had come directly from a shift. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back into something that had started the morning as a bun and had since come partially undone, a few strands falling at her jaw. She was carrying a transparent plastic folder, the kind you buy for $2 at a pharmacy, and inside it were papers, many papers, some folded, some creased down the middle, some printed on the back of what appeared to be a grocery receipt because the library printer had run low on paper. Her eyes were green, and they were swollen, not from crying in the last hour, from crying for months. She walked to the defendant's table and sat down with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who is concentrating very hard on not falling apart in a public place. She placed the folder on the table in front of her and pressed both hands flat on top of it, as if she were afraid it might try to escape. And then, only then, I noticed the chair beside her. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She had blonde hair in 2 lopsided braids, freckles scattered across her nose, and a gap where her 2 front teeth should have been. She was wearing a red plaid dress that had been ironed at some point that morning, though there was a small purple stain near the hem that ironing couldn't fix. One of her socks had slipped down past her ankle. She sat in the adult-sized chair with her legs dangling several inches above the floor, swinging slightly, back and forth, back and forth. In her arms, pressed against her chest with the practiced grip of a child who has carried that particular object everywhere for years, was a teddy bear. Small, brown, worn absolutely smooth in the places where small hands hold things the hardest. The girl looked around the courtroom with the specific expression children have when they're trying to look unafraid and are mostly succeeding. Then she looked at me. I am 67 years old. I have faced senators. I have sentenced men who did not blink. I have delivered verdicts that made grown adults fold in half at the waist. That child looked at me and I felt, very briefly, like I was the one being evaluated. I straightened my glasses. I looked down at the file. Hayes v. Lakeview, LLC. I picked up my pen. The attorney for Lakeview, LLC was a man named Richard Cole. I had seen him in my courtroom before. Not often, but enough. He was the kind of lawyer who wore his competence like a second suit, perfectly fitted, never wrinkled, impossible to find fault with. 52 years old, gray suit, brown leather briefcase that probably cost more than Donna Hayes made in a month. He was not a cruel man. I want to be precise about that because the easy thing, the comfortable thing, would be to make him the villain of this story. He wasn't. He was something more quietly troubling than a villain. He simply didn't see her. Not the way you and I mean when we say we don't notice someone. I mean he looked directly at Donna Hayes, registered her presence as a legal variable, and moved on. The folder, the debt, the property address, the applicable statutes. These things he saw with perfect clarity. The woman in the supermarket uniform with the undone bun and the swollen eyes, she was background. She was the name on the document. He stood when I nodded to him, and he began. The facts, he said, were not in dispute. The property located at 1147 Elm Street had accumulated 26 months of unpaid municipal property taxes. The total outstanding balance, including applicable penalties, was $14,200. The defendant, Donna Hayes, had been formally notified of the delinquency on 3 separate occasions, by certified mail, the dates of which he cited from memory with the ease of someone who had prepared this presentation many times before. The defendant had made no payment arrangements, had not contacted the county tax office, and had not responded to any of the 3 notifications. His client, Lakeview LLC, had acquired the debt through a legal tax lien purchase, and was now exercising its statutory right to foreclose on the property. He paused there, a practiced pause, the kind that says, "And that is everything, Your Honor, because everything else is irrelevant." He sat down and folded his hands on top of his briefcase. I looked at the file. Then I looked at Donna. She was staring at the plastic folder on the table in front of her. Her jaw was tight. I could see the muscle moving just below her ear, that specific tension of someone who is biting down hard on something they don't want to say, or cry, or scream. Her hands were still flat on the folder. The knuckles, I noticed, were white. Beside her, Lily had stopped swinging her legs. She was watching her mother's face the way children watch storms through windows, alert, measuring, quietly calculating whether this was the kind that passed or the kind that didn't. The courtroom heating system clicked. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. I looked at the figures in the document. $14,200, 26 months, 3 certified letters, no response. On paper, it was a pattern, a clear, documented, legally actionable pattern of non-compliance. Richard Cole had done his job without flaw. The statute was unambiguous. The lien was valid. The process had been followed correctly at every step. If I had ruled on the paperwork alone, she would have lost the house before lunch. And here is what 22 years on this bench has taught me about paperwork. It is always accurate, and it almost never tells the whole story. The numbers are real. The dates are real. The certified letters are real. But paperwork cannot record the weight of a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning. It cannot record the specific silence of a house after someone dies in it. It cannot record what a person chooses not to open when the envelopes start arriving, and the grief is still so raw that the brain simply refuses. Not out of irresponsibility, but out of a survival instinct that says one more thing will break me. Paperwork does not record that. That is what judges are for. I set down my pen. I looked at Donna Hayes. She felt my gaze and slowly lifted her eyes from the folder. I want you to understand what I saw in that moment. Not a deadbeat, not a fraudster, not someone gaming the system or trying to get something for nothing. I saw exhaustion so profound it had become structural, the way an old building shows its fatigue not in one dramatic crack but in the slight lean of every wall, the way nothing quite sits level anymore. I saw someone who had been holding too many things for too long and had simply run out of hands. I cleared my throat. The room shifted slightly, that almost imperceptible change in attention that happens when everyone present understands that something important is about to occur. I asked the question that is not in any procedural manual, the question that has no official place in an eviction proceeding, the question that Richard Cole, to his credit, did not object to, perhaps because some part of him, the part underneath the gray suit, also wanted to know the answer. I leaned forward slightly over the bench. My voice was low, not harsh, not pitying, simply direct, the way you speak to someone you are taking seriously. I said, "Ms. Hayes, before we go any further, I need you to tell me why." She blinked. "Not the legal answer," I said, "not what the paperwork says. I want to know why those letters went unanswered. I want to know what was happening in that house for 26 months. I want to know the real story." The plastic folder crinkled slightly under her hands. Lily stopped breathing, it seemed, and looked at her mother. The courtroom waited, and Donna Hayes, for the first time since she had walked through that door, opened her mouth, not to recite facts, not to defend herself with statutes she didn't fully understand, but to simply, finally, tell someone what had actually happened. She didn't start with the taxes. Of course she didn't, because the taxes were never really the beginning of the story. They were just the place where the story finally became visible to the outside world, the point at which private devastation crossed into public record. But the story itself had started much earlier, in the quiet, grinding way that real hardship always does. Not with a single catastrophic moment, but with a series of ordinary losses that accumulate so gradually You don't realize how much weight you're carrying until your knees are already on the floor. She started with Marcus, her husband, 31 years old when he died. A construction worker, she said this without decoration, without the particular self-consciousness some people have when they mention certain kinds of work, because to her it was simply what he was, the same way the sky is simply blue. He fell from scaffolding on a Wednesday morning in October, 3 years before she sat in my courtroom. He was wearing his safety harness. The harness failed. She said this in 11 words, flat, precise. The flatness of someone who has spoken those 11 words so many times that the emotional circuitry has simply disconnected from them out of self-protection. Lily was 3 years old when it happened. I did not write anything down, I just listened. After Marcus, she said, she went back to full-time work at the supermarket, double shifts when she could get them. Her father, Gerald, helped with Lily during the days. That was the arrangement. That was how they survived the first year. Gerald would pick Lily up from daycare, feed her dinner, read to her, keep her until Donna finished the evening shift. It worked. It was hard and it worked, and for a brief period, she thought maybe they were going to be all right. Then Gerald went to the doctor for what he thought was persistent indigestion. It was pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The oncologist used words like aggressive and fast-moving and "we'll do everything we can," which Donna had already learned from Marcus was the medical system's way of preparing you for a particular kind of ending without using the word ending. She had recognized the rhythm of it immediately, the careful optimism, the treatment plans laid out in folders, the parking lots of hospitals at strange hours. For 8 months, she did both things at once. She worked, she cared for him. She brought Lily to Gerald's house on the days he was well enough to want company, because he asked for that, asked specifically for Lily's presence, said it helped him more than the medication. She managed the bills she could see, the electricity, the groceries, the medication co-pays that the insurance didn't cover, and that added up, she said, to somewhere between $200 and $300 every single month. The certified letters from the county tax office, she said, arrived in a pile with everything else. She looked at me when she said the next part, directly, without flinching. I knew they were important, she said. I'm not saying I didn't know, I knew. But every time I picked one up, I thought, I'll deal with this next week, after the next treatment, after he stabilizes, after. She paused. There was always an after that never came. Gerald Hayes died on a Thursday morning in September, 14 months before she sat across from me. He died in the house on Elm Street, in the bedroom where he had slept for 31 years, with Donna on one side of the bed and Lily, who had fallen asleep holding his hand, on the other. The silence in my courtroom was total, not the silence of indifference, the silence of a room full of people who have all, at some point, known a version of this story, who have all sat with something impossible and told themselves after, I'll handle it after. The court reporter had stopped typing. Richard Cole was very still. And then Lily, who had been listening to all of this with the gravity of someone far older than 6, slowly leaned against her mother's arm. Just that. Just the small, certain weight of her daughter's head on her shoulder. Donna closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them and looked at me and waited. I took off my glasses. I have a habit, my clerk has mentioned it more than once, of taking off my glasses when I'm about to say something I need to mean completely, as if removing them allows me to see more clearly in the way that actually matters. Perhaps that's exactly what it does. I thought about my father's house, the brick one with the white fence that needed painting, the hallway that smelled like wood polish and something I have never been able to name precisely, something specific to that house, to that family, to those years. I thought about the afternoon I drove past it for the first time after it was sold, and how the new owners had painted the fence a different color, and how that particular shade of white was gone from the world as completely as if it had never existed. I thought about how I would have given anything, to have had someone sit across from me in that moment and say, I understand what you lost. Let's find another way. I put my glasses back on. I looked at Richard Cole, who met my gaze with the expression of a man who has begun to understand that the shape of the morning has changed around him. And then I looked at Lily. She was watching me with those enormous blue eyes, the worn teddy bear held against her chest, her sock still pooled around her ankle, and I thought, this child walked into a courthouse today to fight for something she cannot even fully articulate, armed with nothing except the absolute certainty that it mattered. I have faced harder things to rule on. I have faced morally complex cases that kept me awake for weeks. This was not one of them. This was, in the end, perfectly clear. I picked up my gavel. "Miss Hayes," I said, "this court recognizes the full debt of $14,200 owed to the county in unpaid property taxes. That debt is real, and I will not pretend otherwise." Her hands tightened on the folder. "However," I said, and I watched her breathe. I watched the exact moment that word landed in her chest. "This court also recognizes that the circumstances under which this debt accumulated constitute a documented case of financial hardship directly linked to caregiving, bereavement, and single-income household strain. Under Section 12 of the State Emergency Property Relief Act, this court is authorized to mandate a structured repayment plan in lieu of foreclosure, with monthly installments calculated proportionally to verified household income." I looked at her steadily. "The eviction order is denied. The property at 1147 Elm Street remains in your name. You will receive paperwork within 10 business days outlining a 60-month repayment schedule. As long as payments are made consistently, Lakeview LLC has no further legal claim to the property." I brought the gavel down. The sound of it filled the room. That single definitive thud that I have heard thousands of times and that still, after all these years, feels like punctuation at the end of a sentence that needed to be said. Donna Hayes did not cheer. She did not leap to her feet. The plastic folder fell from her hands and the papers scattered across the floor, and she made no move to retrieve them. She simply sat very still, both hands now pressed over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with the specific silent violence of a cry that has been held back for so long it no longer knows how to be quiet. Lily looked at her mother. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the teddy bear in her arms, with the solemn expression of a child completing an important transaction. "We did it, Bobo," she whispered. Richard Cole began gathering his papers. He did it slowly, more slowly than necessary. And just before he closed his briefcase, he paused, just for a moment, and looked at Donna Hayes with something that had not been in his face at the beginning of the morning. I don't know what he called it. I called it recognition. The gavel had spoken. The morning had ended the only way it could have, if the law was going to mean anything worth protecting. Courtrooms empty quickly. That is something people don't expect, I think, when they imagine what this work looks like from the inside. They picture the dramatic verdict, the emotional collapse, the gavel, and then they imagine some kind of ceremonial stillness, a held breath that the room maintains out of respect for what just happened. But that's not how it works. The bailiff calls the next case. The clerk pulls the next file. The chairs scrape against the floor. The door opens and closes. The machine moves forward because the machine does not pause to feel things. I have always found that both brutal and correct. By the time I looked up from my notes, the gallery had mostly cleared. Richard Cole was gone. The court reporter was already logging the next proceeding. Two attorneys I didn't recognize were settling into the seats that Donna and Richard had occupied, already deep in their own conversation, already inside their own case, as if the morning's preceding hours had simply been erased and replaced. That is the courtroom. It holds everything and remembers nothing. I am the one who remembers. I watched Donna Hayes from the corner of my eye as she gathered the papers that had fallen from the plastic folder. She picked them up one by one, carefully, smoothing the creases with her thumb before replacing them, with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the papers themselves. It was the movement of someone who needed something physical to do, while the rest of her caught up with what had just happened. Her hands needed a task while her heart sorted through the wreckage and the relief. Lily helped. She slid off the big chair, that same slight scramble, legs too short for the adult world, and crouched down on the courthouse floor in her red plaid dress, picking up pages and handing them up to her mother without being asked. The bobo was tucked under her arm during this operation, supervised but not neglected. I pretended to review my notes. When they finally left, Donna paused at the door, just for a moment. She turned, not fully, just enough, and I saw her profile against the light from the hallway. She didn't say anything. She nodded once, the particular nod of someone who has run out of words adequate to the moment and has decided that silence, offered deliberately, is its own kind of language. I lifted my hand slightly from the bench, just enough. She went through the door. The hallway light disappeared with her. I sat there for a moment longer than I needed to, looking at the empty defendant's table. There was a small smudge on the wood where the plastic folder had been, and on the edge of the chair, Lily's chair, the big one with the legs that didn't reach the floor, there was a single blonde hair, barely visible, curled in a comma against the dark wood. I thought about my father's house, the painted fence, the hallway smell I have never been able to name. Then I straightened my glasses and called for the next case. 7 months later, an envelope arrived at the courthouse addressed to me by name. My clerk brought it in with the morning mail, mildly puzzled, because personal correspondence to a sitting judge is unusual and goes through a particular process before it reaches the bench. It had already been checked, cleared, and flagged as non-legal in nature, meaning it was not a motion, not a complaint, not an appeal, just a letter, a personal letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. When I opened it, something fell out and landed on my desk. I picked it up. It was a drawing, done in crayon. The confident, unself-conscious lines of a child who draws without worrying about proportion or perspective, or whether the chimney is the right size relative to the door. There was a house, brown with yellow windows and a red roof, and a front path made of careful, deliberate circles that I understood were meant to be stepping stones. There was a tree in the yard, oversized and magnificently green. There were 3 figures standing in front of the house: a tall woman with dark brown hair, a small girl with yellow braids, and beside them, rendered in the same brown crayon as the house, a small rectangle with 2 button eyes and 2 round ears. The bobo. She had drawn the bobo as a member of the family. And above the house, in the sky between 2 lopsided clouds, she had drawn a 4th figure, taller, fainter, the crayon pressed more lightly, as if she understood instinctively that this one belonged to a different kind of space. An old man with a wide smile and what appeared to be a halo, though it may simply have been a very ambitious hat. Gerald Hayes. Watching over the house from wherever he had gone. Below the drawing, in the large, effortful handwriting of a child who has recently learned that letters can become words, and words can become something that travels across the world to find someone. Thank you for keeping Grandpa's smell safe. I sat at my desk for a long time with that drawing in my hands. My clerk came in once, saw my face, and left without saying anything. He has worked with me for 11 years. He knows when to leave the coffee and go. I eventually learned through the county payment system that Donna Hayes had not missed a single installment in those 7 months. Not one. She was working double shifts at the supermarket. I didn't know that then, but I know it now because she wrote it in the letter, matter-of-factly, the way she seemed to say all the hard things. Double shifts are difficult, but Lily is doing well in 1st grade and the house still smells like him. And I think that's enough for now. I have been a judge for 22 years. I have sat across from senators and criminals and grieving mothers and frightened children and people whose stories I will carry for the rest of my life. And in all that time, across all those cases and all those faces, I have come to believe one thing above everything else that I could tell you about the law or justice or the work of this bench. The truth is this: the system is not built to see people. It is built to process them. And that is not entirely wrong. Scale requires systems, and systems require structure, and structure requires that individual complexity be reduced, occasionally, to a number on a page. I understand this. I have made peace with it mostly. But there are moments, there will always be moments, when the number on the page is $14,200, And behind that number is a woman who spent 8 months watching her father die while raising her daughter alone, while working double shifts, while grief made the certified letters impossible to open. And the only attorney in the room is the one working against her. And the only advocate she brought with her is 6 years old and carrying a bear. In those moments, the system needs a human being sitting inside it. That is what a judge is for. Not to ignore the law, never that, but to remember that the law was written by people for people, and that the moment it stops serving the human being standing in front of it, it has failed at the only thing that ever mattered. Donna Hayes came into my courtroom with papers she printed at a library and a daughter she had nowhere to leave. And she told me the truth without a single rehearsed word. Lily Hayes walked up to my bench with a worn teddy bear and offered me everything she owned. They gave me more than they will ever know. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something in it that you want to hold on to, I want you to do one thing before you go. Not for me. For the next person who needs to hear a story like this one. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment below telling me which moment hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded today that compassion still exists in the world. Because it does. I have seen it. I have ruled from it. And on the best days, the days that make 22 years on this bench feel not like a weight but like a privilege, it walks into my courtroom wearing a red plaid dress with a sock fallen down around the ankle, carrying a worn-out bear, and it looks me directly in the eye, and it does not look away. If this story stayed with you, pause for just a moment and ask yourself something honest. Have you ever carried a weight so heavy, grief, loss, impossible circumstance, that the things you knew you should handle simply became things you could not touch? Have you ever been reduced to a number, a file, a case, by a system, by a person, by a situation, when the truth of what you were going through was so much larger than anything a document could contain? And have you ever witnessed a moment where one human being chose to look past the paperwork and see the person, and felt in that moment that the world was still worth believing in? That is what Donna Hayes gave me that Tuesday morning, and that is what Lily gave all of us. Tell us in the comments what moment hit you the hardest. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about compassion, second chances, and the kind of justice that remembers we are all human, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because these stories exist, and they deserve to be heard.